Welcome, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers. I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is a social justice nonprofit that mobilizes justice-seeking people of faith to take action on issues of peace, poverty, and people's rights within the church, the nation, and the world. We are so excited to be co-hosting this webinar with our dear partner, the Association of Ministers with Disabilities. I will share a few announcements concerning our call today. If you're able, please continue to keep your video off and the audio on mute. We have a lot of folks on this call, and it will help us to hear our speakers and to help with the connection. We are recording the webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. We ask that for the rest of the webinar that we can reserve the chat for questions. If you have questions, please type them in the chat. And if you would prefer to voice your questions aloud, there will be an opportunity for that during the Q&A time. We're also offering closed captioning and apologize ahead of time for spelling mistakes or any other errors. They are automatically generated. Our ASL interpreters, Reverend Leo Yates and Sarah Yates, have identified themselves as interpreters in their name. And so you can feel free to pin them on your screen if you would like. We're also spotlighting them, so you should be able to see our interpreters throughout the webinar. Thanks again. I'll turn this over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Bridget. First, I want to thank Bridget and MFSA for partnering with us on this webinar. My name is Reverend Jonathan Campbell, and I'm an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and I'm the co-chair of the Association with Ministers with Disabilities, AMD for short. I would like to welcome all of you today as we, on behalf of the membership of AMD, as we celebrate the 25th anniversary of this groundbreaking book in Homiletics, Biblical Studies and Theology. AMD is a caucus within the United Methodist Church. Even though we are part of the United Methodist Church, AMD's primary mission is to advocate for, support, and help empower all individuals with disabilities who are clergy or who are seeking to share their gifts in ministry. AMD is a gathering place for individuals with disabilities to support and mentor each other and the next generation of clergy. AMD's mission also includes educating people of faith, especially clergy, both those with and without disabilities, about how they can more effectively support and empower individuals with disabilities to share their God-given gifts. AMD has a monthly online support group, Bible studies, and book club. And we are also soon going to launch the Accessible God podcast. If you would like to learn more about any of these endeavors or more about AMD, please visit our website at umdisabledministers.org or check out our Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter accounts. And now I'll turn it over to my co-chair, Hank.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for being with us today. This is an exciting event for us, one that we have been looking forward to for quite some time. As Jonathan said, my name is Reverend Hank Jenkins. I am an ordained deacon in the United Methodist Church, and I am a disabled person. You can't see it now through the video, but I use a wheelchair, and I have been paraplegic for 33 years. It is my honor today to introduce you to our two main guests for today's discussion. The first person I would like to introduce to you is a good friend of mine, someone I hold dear to my heart, but he will be the moderator for today's discussion. Reverend Russell Yule is an ordained elder of the United Methodist Church. He currently serves as the senior pastor at Pitts Chapel United Methodist Church in Springfield, Missouri. Russell is also the chair emeritus of the Association of Ministers with Disabilities, and he serves as a board member of Missouri Faith Voices. Russell is a person with a disability and has the distinction of being the first blind person ordained in the Missouri Conference of the United Methodist Church. His ministries include advocating for people to realize their power and how to achieve their life goals. He gives talks across the country on disability advocacy and awareness, the disability rights movement, the intersection of religion and disability, and the intersectionality of disability and Black theology. He is passionate about empowering the disenfranchised and assisting all people in realizing their potential, purpose, and worth in church and society. The second person I would like to introduce to you is our very, very, very special guest today. Reverend Dr. Kathy Black is an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church who is the Gerald Kennedy Chair of Homiletics and Liturgics at the Claremont School of Theology. Since childhood, she has experienced spells of paralysis resulting from exposure to a toxic lake. Dr. Black has served as a chaplain at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., the only liberal arts college for deaf persons in the world. She has also served as the associate pastor of Washington United Methodist Church of the Deaf and as the founding pastor of Magathie United Methodist Church for the Deaf in Pasadena, Maryland. She taught the Washington Semester for Deaf Ministry at Wesley Theological Seminary before joining the faculty at Claremont. Her research and teaching interests center on ministries with persons with disabilities, feminist liturgy, multicultural worship, comparative ritual practices, and the role of art in worship. It is, as I said, it is an honor to have both of you with us, and we welcome you both to this time together, and we look forward to a wonderful discussion. Russell, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hank. And we look forward to this conversation as well. Dr. Black, it is wonderful to be with you today. And let me get this out of the way before we get started, because I now have the opportunity to say this in front of everyone. I am fanboying over here, if I can use that term. You have been such a great resource and a source of and forgive me for using this word, but yes, inspiration. Your work has helped to give a voice for many of us who with disabilities who had these ideals, but for the first time were ever able to see them written in a text. And so I just wanted to get that out of the way before we began our time together today. It is such a great honor again to be with you today. How are you doing? Let me just start with saying that.
I'm doing great, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm so honored that you're celebrating this book I wrote so many years ago. Yeah, it's been a gift to be able to participate with you today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, again, for all of you all who are online, we want to remind you that you can leave questions in the chat box, and we will be able to get to most of them after a while. Let me begin, Dr. Black, with, I guess, an introductory kind of question about your book. And just wanted to find out, what was your inspiration for the book and for its title as well?
Well, it really was personal. I was fed up, like many people with disabilities, the way the church was dealing with issues, theology. It just was not my experience. And I wanted to be able to get that out now that I had a job as a professor and publishing companies would actually take me seriously. and you have to publish in order to be a professor and get promoted. I was like, I got to get this out. This is what's burning in my heart. And so for me, there were issues about how the church deals with children and adults with disabilities. I was raised in a congregation that, on the one hand, had a deaf family, and never ever thought of including sign language interpreters. Wouldn't even cross their mind. He served, the man, Mr. Farr, served as Sunday school secretary for my mother's kindergarten class for 30, 40 years. And he served as an usher in worship, and he never understood a word. And it didn't make any sense to me. On the other hand, I worked with a teenager who was blind, Mary Beth. And the UMW groups, they all got together, and each UMW circle would take one aspect of independent living. This was back in the 70s, before that was very popular. And so one circle would do sewing the French knots in their clothes so that they knew how to match clothing together. One dealt with money and how you folded money. My circle dealt with mobility. I would take her out, how do you ride an escalator in a mall? Or, I mean, so there were some really positive things. I was doing, working at a cerebral palsy center when I was in college, and there was a boy there who it was a deaf-blind preschool and a cerebral palsy center. So I had two different jobs. And in the deaf-blind preschool, there was a boy there who had adrenoleukodystrophy, and that was made popular by the movie Lorenzo's Oil. Anyway, he became deaf and blind within a few weeks' time. And his parents had other children, and they went to take him to Sunday school, and the Sunday school didn't want him because they didn't know what to do with a deaf and blind first grader. And so there was all this frustration about the role of the church in building community and being supportive and being accessible and open. And then there was this whole lot of stuff that I was dealing with in terms of theology. And the theology that either you're a sinner, you don't have enough faith. There was, we've all heard it. And then there was the liberal side that was saying, using paralysis and blindness and deafness as metaphors for sin. I'm like, well, that doesn't help either. And so then there was this whole thing about the omnipotence of God, and the all-powerful God, and the all-loving God. And then there was like, well, if God is all-loving and all-powerful, then why doesn't God intervene in ways to stop some of the suffering? And so I was challenging notions of omnipotence. For me, omnipresence was much more important. The presence of God accompanying me on my journey as a person with disability, rather than reconciling this omnipotence and all loving. So that I had all kinds of stuff that I wanted to say. And language was a big issue for me. I wanted to be a person before I was disabled. So I wanted to be a person with a disability as opposed to the disabled. I wanted to deal with language of God. I was doing, when I was at Magathy Church of the Deaf, I was doing religious education classes at the Columbia School for the Deaf and the Frederick School for the Deaf in Maryland. And the kids would say to me, God doesn't know sign language, so we can't do prayer. I mean, you hear God. I'm like, no, I don't really hear God. Right? So like, what is it? But it's the language that we use. God hears our prayers, right? So it's the language that we use that equates sensory blindness, deafness, paralysis with sin, that conveys that we hear and God doesn't. I mean, yeah. So I was fed up, and I wanted to get it out of me before I moved on to other projects, because this really was a personal journey for me. And this was a personal statement as well as a theological statement and a biblical statement about how we interpret the biblical text. So for me, it was an important piece that I needed to convey to the world. And I finally had a platform in which to do it. And so that was my first major book. The title, I wanted healing in the title because it felt to me that preaching, and especially preaching those healing narratives, what we call the healing narratives, which are really about cure. And I wanted to deal with the difference between healing and cure, because there's a big difference between healing and cure. So I wanted healing in the title. And the subtitle is not what I wanted. But the subtitle I wanted was way too long, and the publisher said no. So I wanted persons with disabilities rather than preaching and disability. And yeah, I didn't get that far, but I did get a new image on the cover, because the original image on the cover was arguing against what I was saying in the book. So I had to find something that would work for the message that I was trying to convey.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. I know that even further down the line, our colleague Jonathan had a question, and you answered that question, I think, just now. One of the questions I know he had later on. And so thank you for that. And then also, you'd mentioned the fact about the language that we use and the language that was used in the church, and how it even spills over into our lives and our beliefs. And so I'm so grateful, and I know we all are grateful for this work, because it challenges some of those notions. I know that there was this thing going around for a while that a person who was deaf could not know God. And I asked the question to somebody one day, and they said, and I said, why would you say something like that? And they quote unquote quoted a scripture and said that, well, the Bible says that he that have an ear, let him hear the word of God.
That's right.
And
faith comes through hearing.
Yes, and that's what and so from their perspective, then that meant then a person could not be could not be a Christian, quote unquote. But you know that. So let me ask you, and I'm going to ask you to take off your kind of humble role for just a moment and hear the question. Did you ever imagine that the book would be hailed and celebrated as widely as it has been by professors of homiletics and by theologians and by people writing in the area of disabilities and by pastors and by teachers, and we know for sure by seminarians? Did you imagine that it would be as widely held as it has been?
No, I had no clue whatsoever. It really was a personal journey for me. I wrote it for my communities at the time, which were Gallaudet College, back then university now, which was a college for deaf students, and for the deaf churches that I had been serving. And for the people that I grew up with, people at the deafblind preschool and Mary Beth and, the churches, I wrote it for that. And then it's like, once you put it out there, it has a life of its own. You have no clue. I have been shocked that the book was translated into French in Switzerland. It was translated into Korean, and there was a Japanese translation that was in the works. I've never seen the final version, so I don't know if that actually got finished. But the main one that surprised me the most was a Pentecostal professor teaching in seminary in South Africa,
Mm.
who wrote me and interviewed me about the book for his own work in South Africa. So that was, oh, and then there was in Turkey, there's a man in Turkey who was using the book. And I'm like, how did it ever get its way into Turkey? But yeah, so I've been totally shocked by how well it's been received. But it just speaks to the need to say something different than what we've been formed with theologically and homiletically.
Yes, indeed. I remember in seminary, even my time in seminary, the need for someone to write something that we were all thinking and contemplating, and something to be widely appreciated and celebrated and accepted by academia was something that a lot of us just begged for. And so again, we thank you for the work that you have done thus far. I had another question. So a professor of mine once said that doing theology is kind of like entering into a coffee shop or so. And there is this conversation that has been going on before you arrived. But then you arrive and you join in with the group and you begin to have a conversation with them, but you don't change the conversation, but you add to it. And because you come in with your own, and I'm sorry, interpreters, but you come in with your own Sitzenleben. You come in from your own place where you stand. You come in with your own understanding of the world, and you enter into that conversation. And so in what ways would you say that the healing homiletic has added to the theological dialogue in, yes, the area of disabilities, we know, but even broader? What ways would you say that it has added to this conversation, this dialogue, this theological dialogue?
I think it has added to the conversation about how biblical texts can be oppressive or healing, depending on interpretation and what we bring to it and what we take away from the biblical text. So, you know, feminists are reading it, persons from the LGBTQIA community are reading the biblical text now and finding texts that are healing and oppressive. So I think it has contributed to that larger conversation. I also think it's contributed to a larger conversation around interdependence. So one of the things that I was arguing in the book is a theology of interdependence. There's a woman who teaches, Korean woman who teaches worship and preaching at Emmanuel College in Toronto, Hayron Kim Cragg, and she wrote a book called Interdependence, in which she drew from my work. But it's also a thing that's in physics, it's in science. We are all interrelated. We are all interdependent, right? You know, the butterfly that flaps its wings on one side of the world has an impact elsewhere. And so this whole notion that we can be independent, American, pull yourselves up by the bootstrap kind of notion is just false. And we are all interconnected. We are all interdependent upon one another. So I think that conversation is probably more important, but also the biblical studies, which is being done by a lot of people today.
Wonderful, wonderful. We want to remind those of you, our guests, that you have the ability to put a question in the chat space, and we will be entertaining those in just a few moments. Another question for you. Are you surprised that after 25 years that no one, at least that we are familiar with, has picked up this conversation where you left off? and began to write in her or his own voice by way of a serious text, a serious book?
I am. I put it out there as a conversation starter and expected people to, work with it, argue with it, add to it. And it hasn't fully happened. There is a new book called The Disabled Church, Human Difference and the Art of Communal Worship by Rebecca Spurrier. She's a new PhD grad out of Vanderbilt teaching at Columbia Theological Seminary. And I think she's in the area of worship. So it's more in the area of worship than in homiletics and preaching. But there really, it has not been much added to this book. So I would hope that others would take it up, but it hasn't happened. I think that's one reason why the book is still in use, because it hasn't been supplanted by something more recent.
Our hope as AMD is always that new theologians will come along and begin to enter into these conversations. Later on, there is a question that I will raise that a lot of us are wrestling with, and one of our concerns, but we'll get to that after a while. So if there were someone who were exploring this topic today, how would you like to see them approach it, and where would you like to see them go with it?
Oh, that's a good question. There are so many more texts, first of all, right? My book only dealt with a handful that are the key healing texts in the lectionary, and there are so many more. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in biblical studies. Now, there are 3 texts out now in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And so that is great to see that happening. But there really hasn't been a lot more done on the New Testament. So that would be something that needs to be done. I also think when I first wrote this book, I wanted to include sample sermons at the end, and that didn't happen, publisher and for different reasons. But I also think that examples and sermons would be great. The ones that you all are already preaching out there, to get some of those sermons out there in whatever way we can. Because I think how we do it and what examples we use and what narratives are being told are really, really important to convey and into the world. So I struggle with an argument in the book that challenges God's omnipresence, omnipotence, like I said earlier, the all-powerful nature of God, in favor of omnipresence. But I also realized later that the book is written from a person of power, American, I'm white, and there's a bias in some ways that people have access to healthcare. And so the issue there for me is that for many people in the world and in our own country, God's power and prayer for healing, not just healing, but prayer for cure, is their only healthcare. And I named it in the book 1 or 2 sentences as kind of a caveat, but I think that also needs to be addressed a little bit more, because when prayer and God are the only possibilities of healthcare, of cure, or some sort of relief from suffering. We don't want to negate that, but at the same time, we also want to recognize that cure and healing are very different, and God can accompany us on the journey, regardless of whether we experience a cure. My brother-in-law's had his leg amputated from sarcoma tumor, cancerous tumor, and the leg's not going to grow back. So what is curable, what's not? I mean, there are so many different questions and issues, but I don't want to deny people the power of God or the power of prayer, especially for those who have no other access to healthcare.
Thank you. Oh, that was very good. Thank you. Thank you. That is, I know that's something that a lot of us wrestle with, because we, again, like you said, don't want to negate the power of prayer. But I think where it gets problematic is when others make assumptions about the person with a disability, and that might be the thing that they are seeking. I recall a friend of mine that we went, and many of us have experienced this, in their own church, and they're on the prayer team. She's a person with cerebral palsy, and there was a prayer service that went on, and someone from the outside came in, and they asked if anyone wanted prayer. And so they came specifically to her, and she says, "No, I'm fine." And so then finally, she says, "Okay, if you want to pray for my mother, who," and I'm not sharing anything that she has not shared, and you don't know her name, but she pray for my mother, who is an alcoholic, and she's about to kill herself because she's drinking. They prayed for her for maybe 30 seconds about that, and then went straight to healing. And so that seems to supersede any other thing that a person with a disability might be wrestling with and going through in their lives. And but thank you for that, because that helps us to kind of ground ourselves and not to negate the power of prayer. So I think most of us still believe in that, though. So Jonathan, this would be a great time.
I have some questions.
Do you have any questions from the
Yeah.
chat?
Yeah, I have some questions from the chat. Someone asked, Dr. Black, what is your best advice for someone working with a congregation around these topics for the first time? So you're engaging folks with disability theology, the idea of how to reread healing narratives. What advice would you give?
It needs to begin, it needs to have clergy support. I know there are a lot of lay people who have tried to do this within their congregations, and it's gone no place without clergy support. So it's really important that clergy, all you clergy out there on this webinar, that you provide support for the lay people. Do it through preaching, do it through religious education, invite people in, start with people within your congregation. There are many ways by which we can make this happen, but it's important. It's important that you start focused, in my opinion. So this notion that all are welcome, we can't really pull that off. What Russell needs as a person who's blind and what someone who needs who's deaf are two different things. One needs oral, one needs visual. What a person with Tourette's syndrome needs, or children with autism need, is very different from what people with mental illness need. Or there are so many different situations in our world of disability that it's really important to focus, because we can't be all things to all people. So what is it that your congregation, is it because in your community you've got a school for the deaf, or in your community or in your congregation you have a child or an adult, like at my church back home, with this young woman, this teenager who was blind, and the UMW kind of rallied around. What is it that is important for you? We want the general concept out there constantly about accessibility, about openness, about interdependence, about theology, so that in your preaching, your teaching, whatever is going on, your Bible studies, biblical interpretation, we want that generally out there. But in terms of specific programs within a congregation, it is super helpful if you work either within your denominations, congregations in an area, and say, if this congregation is going to have an interpreter, sign language interpreter, then this congregation may want to focus in some other area with children's ministry, or within a town, across denominations even, because the denomination is important for some people, but today denomination affiliation is less important than the program that's being offered. And so being able to share resources and share responsibilities and have some joint activities, but also have a focus, I think is really important.
There's a couple questions in the chat about wishing you to speak about neurodiversity and invisible disabilities and how the texts speak to them.
Yeah, so neurodiversity was not even a term back when I wrote this book. Neurodiversity, that there have been other books written on neurodiversity, and that's something that I was not as familiar with personally. It was something that I was not, I hadn't studied in any way academically. So I did not focus in any way on neurodiversity in that book. It was more what I was familiar with, my own experience, physical disability, communication access with deafness, and persons who are blind. But that's a whole other book that needs to be written on neurodiversity and worship and neurodiversity and preaching. I know my colleague, Kathleen Grider, in Spiritual Care and Counseling, wrote a book called Much Madness is Divinest Sense. And out of her own personal experience with a mother who was in and out of, back then in the 60s, what they called psych wards or mental institutions. And so she wrote that book out of her own experience, out of her field of study, which is spiritual care and counseling. So there needs to be a whole other book that's written on neurodiversity and worship and preaching.
Another question is, you wrote this wonderful work 25 years ago. It's increased the knowledge base about this topic, but unfortunately, a lot of things in the church hasn't changed. What advice would you give to somebody that's entering this discussion on an academic level, or even in a denominational level? What advice would you give about engaging church leadership, engaging academic leaders in this topic?
Yeah, for me, denominations need to step up, and each denomination adds additional requirements to ordination than are required for graduation in theological seminaries. And so we want to say theological seminaries are responsible for all the different topics. And in many ways we should be, but we have, especially in the Master of Divinity degree, it's a breadth degree. Students have to have Bible theology, ethics, history, preaching, worship, religious education, spiritual care and counseling, religious leadership. There are so many topics that have to be covered in the breadth of a Master of Divinity degree. And so we try in theological education to merge into our existing required courses issues around racism, issues around disability studies, issues around gender and feminist studies, LGBTQIA issues, around post-colonial issues. But then it's minuscule, right? Like it's a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, a little bit there. In reality, when I used to offer a class on ministry with persons with disabilities as an elective, I'd have 4 students, 5 students who would take the class. And so the assumption was that if we get it into required classes that everybody has to take, we'd reach more people and expose more people. But you're exposing a broader group of people with less knowledge. So denominations have a role that they can play in requiring additional, either for ordination itself or for continuing education post-ordination. And that is essential. The organizations like AMD is great. And actually these webinars are probably attracting more people than would come to the in-person conferences, right? So doing these virtual conferences is also helpful to spread the word and get the topic out there. Right now, there are so many other topics, Black Lives Matter, racism, decolonialism, that it's kind of like the disability issue was very popular in the 80s and 90s and not as much so in the 2000s. I think we've gone backwards. Same with feminist studies, but I think we're going backwards in terms of exposure and in terms of education and in terms of access.
Another question from the chat. The person asking the question references some scripture passages about that Jesus obviously worked with and affirmed people with disabilities. So did Paul. Why do you think the church left that work of working with people with disabilities and affirming them?
That's the best question ever, because if you look at the Gospels, the majority of Jesus' ministry is working with people with disabilities.
Yeah.
But somehow over the centuries, the theology developed that people with disabilities were being punished. People with disabilities were sinners. And look at who was developing the theology. Primarily able-bodied, Western, European men who had power. And so they got to control the narrative of what theologies were normative. And so over time, it became the norm. And so you wanted to avoid associating with persons who were considered sinners or being punished by God. You certainly didn't want to help them. You didn't want to intervene. If God was doing the punishing, then you hands off. And so the church basically took that position, hands off. Or like Russell said earlier, you know, the decisions people made that deaf people can't be baptized because they can't verbally affirm their testimony, right? Their profession of faith, or faith comes by hearing. So over time, the church has totally ignored the Gospels. again, the church has totally ignored that Jesus was not rich and wealthy, that Jesus' ministry was to the poor. So it's not just persons with disabilities. They've totally, prosperity gospel is on the rise. Where did that come from? That's not who Jesus was. So we make the gospels, we make Jesus become who we want Jesus to be. And yeah, so we totally ignore what Jesus did. Primary emphasis, what Jesus did was healing. In that time period, it had to be cure in its own way, but there were multiple forms of healing and bringing people back into community with one another who were on the margins of society. And Christianity today is absolutely at the heart of power and prosperity. So it's a great question. I clearly have no answer, but it needs to be named again and again and again that we're misinterpreting the gospel.
Well, you gave us a lot of seeds for contemplation, so we appreciate that.
Sorry, I can get preaching if you
No. I think you left us with some amazing places to start that work. Another question from the chat wanted to discuss mental health. How do we engage these texts around mental health when there's so much fear, not only in the text sometimes, but also in our churches about mental health issues?
Yeah, mental health issues are very complicated. Okay, so I have a physical disability and I never could control my body. I never knew when it was going to get paralyzed, when I was going to have periods of being zombied, slow motion. But I was able to depend upon my mind and my mental acuity to get me through. For me, and I confess, for me, it would have been scary for me for the reverse to have been true. And that's a confession I make. It's a confession that is not a good one, because for me to feel like my body was in total control and that was fine, everything was great, but my mind in some way was not, that feels scarier to me. And I think that is a confession that many in our society also need to make. And it causes us, for horrible reasons, it causes us to keep a distance. It causes us to, it's unknown territory. We don't know what to do with it. We don't know how to respond. We don't know how to relate. And so it's another one of those hands off. We don't know what to do. And so we just keep a distance from it. And so we need people who live with those conditions, which is why Kathleen Greider's book, Much Madness' Divine Essence, was so important, because she interviewed people and asked these questions about soul care. Like, what is the soul care that is needed for persons who have some sort of issues with mental health? And what do they know about God? What is their testimony about who God is and what God does for us? Because we need those narratives, we need those testimonies, we need those in preaching as examples, as stories. We need those in our biblical studies, our Bible study classes. We need to be able to name these for those who don't have access to publishing companies, who don't have access to these sources to get their stories told. Monica, she's also a Claremont professor. Monica Coleman's Bipolar Faith is a fabulous text. Yeah, and this comes out of her own life story. So these testimonies, these books need celebrating as well, because they are telling different stories than what mine did.
Jonathan, let me jump back in here
Absolutely.
for two quick questions. Well, maybe not so quick, but I know that there was something that
Christ on the Psych Ward. Yes, that's another one.
which one was that?
Christ on the Psych Ward.
Okay, okay. Yeah, there are two quick questions that I want to make sure that we get in, and I know that we have been addressing in the disability community, and particularly with AMD and some others who are interested in these areas. And your conversation about needing to write reminded me of that. And so if someone, especially a person with a disability has been thinking about and praying about or toying with the ideal of researching and writing in any of the broad areas of theology and disability, what advice would you give to someone who was in the process of thinking through that?
Do it. Because here, I know you can't get published by the main publishers, but we can't either anymore.
Mm.
The truth is, hard copy publishing is out the window, right? They're having trouble staying in business. People aren't reading books in the same way anymore. So do the blogs, make 10-minute videos, TED Talks, get them out there on the internet. You will have much more exposure that way than publishing a book. It takes a couple of years. By the time you go through the process, write the book, get it published, it's old data anyway. So get it out there, get it into the internet. The shorter, the better. So whether it's a Facebook or a blog post, or it's called a public scholar, being a public scholar, you all can be a public scholar. Every one of you can be a public scholar. Do it. You will have many more people exposed to your ideas, your thoughts, your experiences, your narratives than if you were to write a book. This was appropriate back 25 years ago, but that's not the way of the future.
Thank you for that. You actually, that's a conversation that we have quite often, that people are concerned with, and concerned about the fact that
yes,
heretofore our testimonies were told, our scenarios were written about us, but we did not have a voice. People with disabilities did not have a voice. And so one of the major critiques from the disability community continues to be the lack of representation of their voices in academic text. And one of the reasons that's cited, and forgive me because I'm couching my question, I'm not even getting close to the question yet, but one of the reasons that's cited, it appears to be systemic. If admitted, many people with significant disabilities have found it difficult to matriculate through the academic rigors of religious institutions to obtain a PhD, to obtain a THD, to obtain a DMin, to obtain a MDiv, a MTS, or a MAPS degree. And so this was kind of, and I know it's a dated book now, but it was outlined in the 2003 text edited by Robert C. Anderson, entitled Graduate Theological Education and the Human Experience of Disabilities. And that was one of the texts I used all the time to fight with my seminary. And so the question really is, have you seen any significant changes in institutions realizing the need to provide individualized reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities as they try to get admitted and to matriculate through religious institutions?
I've seen positive and negative. So on the positive side, ADA made a huge difference. No educational institution today can be accredited without having a disability service office. And those are evaluated in their yearly evaluations and accreditation approval processes. And that has made a difference for people getting access into education and getting some services, accommodations for them, even in theological education. But there are two things. One, if you wanted to get a degree in disability studies, as opposed to engineering, or as opposed to math, or something else, if you wanted to get a PhD in disability studies, that is super hard. Why? Because there's got a PhD, there's got to be more than one class. You've got to have an entire department at the institution in disability studies. You've got to have faculty who know more than you do, which is always a question. You've got to have people who can direct your dissertation. You've got to have people, so disability studies as a discipline is getting harder and harder to come by because schools are in trouble and they're cutting. And so what are they cutting? They're not cutting math and science and English, right? They're cutting the extras, what they consider to be extras. So it's very hard to find today institutions of higher education in the country that have a PhD in disability studies, one. Two, if you had a PhD in disability studies, you wouldn't get a job because there aren't the jobs out there to get the job because the schools are cutting. So that's another problem. And three, theological education. We got exempted from disability. We got exempted from ADA. We got exempted because most freestanding schools don't have the number of employees that are needed to comply with all of ADA. Some theological schools try to do it, but not all. And the cost is just really hard for theological schools. And so it's really hard. Theological schools have dropped the ball. And I'm at Claremont, and we're considered progressive and justice oriented and all that, but we don't have an elevator in a couple of the buildings because the buildings are so old, and there's all kinds of excuses and reasons, but and we're leaving this campus possibly. We've got a satellite campus in Salem, Oregon now, which is fully accessible at Willamette University. And that's a great thing. But there are problems across the board in getting persons with disabilities getting access to disability studies programs, getting PhDs in you can get a PhD in other topics, but not in disability studies as easily.
That's one of the questions that we get quite often. People are calling in and they're frustrated. They're seeking AMD's assistance and the Committee on Disabilities of the United Methodist Church assistance and advocating and just trying to find another some way in which to progress to get these degrees. And we are still to this day, people are wrestling with that, and that's a concern for all of us at this point.
Kathy Webb just posted saying she thinks there's only 5 in the world. She has one. 5 programs in the world that do disability studies. That's one of the big issues. But if you want a PhD in spiritual formation or spiritual care and counseling, you can get a PhD as a person with a disability. I can't imagine you wouldn't be able to do that. The issue is getting it in disability studies.
Okay. Jonathan, do you have any other questions? I have plenty more, but want to find out if there's others from the chat.
Yeah, I'll throw out one to you. Any thoughts about how we help members of our church deal with the reality of what we know now about evolutionary science, that death did not come after the sin? And so disability and disease are part of natural life, not a result of human sin.
Yeah, it's what you believe about the Bible. If you believe the Bible is infallible and inerrant, meaning the Bible has no errors and the Bible cannot be wrong in any way, shape, or form, and if you have a literal interpretation of the Bible, it's really hard to have conversations with persons because there will always be a quote. They know their Bible inside and out, and there will always be a quote from the Bible. And so it really does go back to your interpretation of the Bible. What do you believe about the Bible? If you believe that the Bible was God inspired, not dictated, but God inspired, if you believe that it was culturally determined in that time and place, and was written for particular reasons, and there are lots of books out there that didn't make it into the Bible, into the canon, what we call the canon. There's other gospels, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas. There are lots of other books that didn't make it into the Bible. And still today, the Roman Catholic Bible, the Protestant Bible, the Orthodox Bible, even within Christianity, is not the same. Which books are we considered to be sacred and part of the canon? But if you have any sense that it's infallible and inerrant, and that it's a literal interpretation, it's really hard to have conversation. And so you have to begin with history of the Bible, so people understand the history of how we came to this Bible, before you can have those conversations. So education on history is essential.
Thank you.
And translations, like the translation process, who gets to decide how you translate sozein, which is to save, to heal, or to cure? Is it to save or is it to cure? Like, right? Like, how are you translating this Greek word?
Yeah. Thank you. Seems to be pretty much the extent of the questions that are out there right now.
Okay.
There were some great comments that I saw popping up.
There were a lot of
great
comments,
resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I hope we keep track of all of the comments, because there's some wonderful resources that are people are naming that I didn't.
Yeah, and there's also I don't know if you caught this, Dr. Black, there was also an offer to translate the book into Indian dialect. So you might want to have that conversation.
Well, here's the thing though. The book was translated into French,
Yeah.
but handicap is in the title. Like the front cover of the book says it's French, but I can tell it's handicap. So I have no idea how they interpreted it. Same issue with Greek to English. I have no idea how they interpreted it. I would never use the word handicap.
Yeah.
I argue against it in the book. And yet it's on the front cover of the French version. And so, I don't know what the book says. So working with the translators is helpful, but I did not work with any of the translators of this book. So I really don't know what they say.
Again, we encourage you all to send your questions in, write your questions
Thank
in.
you, Kelly.
Yes. Write your questions in and Jonathan will pick those up. Dr. Black, looking back, is there anything that you would have changed about or would have added to your book had you known then what you know now?
I would have added the neurodiversity piece. It would have delayed the publication of the book by years because it would have been a major study that I would have needed to undertake in order to feel confident in adding that component to it. I didn't. So that's its own work that still needs to be done in terms of preaching and worship, but I would have done that. I said earlier, I would have given more attention to those for whom prayer and God's power is the only source of healthcare. Yeah, I think I would have given a little bit more attention to that. I would have added the sermons. There were some things that I would have done, but in general, it was just something I needed to write at the time and get off my chest, so to speak.
We understand. What is your, for those of us who are very curious now, what is your area of research or concentration in today? And this is a two-part question. Did your work in the area of disability speak to what you're doing now? Was it fluent? Was it like a progression? So what are you doing now? What's your area of research? And did your writings in the area of disability speak to that?
That's a great question. I would not be who I am today. I would not be the preacher I am today. I would not be the communicator I am today without my years in deaf ministry. Hands down. Like my facial expressions, how I tell stories chronologically. I can't talk without my hands. I'm keeping them in my lap at the moment. Without a doubt, my years in ministry with persons in the deaf community absolutely influenced who I am. How I write. I wanted my writing to be accessible to persons for whom English was not their first language. And for persons who are culturally deaf and raised with ASL as their first language, English is a second language. And so I wanted it, which has helped tremendously because I have a huge amount of international students and students for whom English is a second language. So that kind of formation and wanting my work to be accessible, not just my writing to be accessible, but my work to be accessible, all came from those years of my own personal journey, but also my years working in the deaf community. So hands down, absolute influence. After this book, my work was in multicultural worship and looking at cultural difference. So I was formed by the deaf culture, which saw it as a culture with its own language, its own cultural context and practices. And so it was easy for me to morph into understanding other cultures and other languages. Obviously, I didn't understand other languages, but how those form the culture, how those form preaching, how those form their spirituality. And so then what happens when you put them into different people from different cultures into one worship space? So first I studied the individual cultures and languages in superficial way, the language, but the cultures, interviewing people and clergy and lay people from different cultures, what their worship practices were. And that came out as Worship Across Cultures book. And then what do we do when they're in the same congregation? And that came out as Culturally Conscious Worship. My recent work, because Claremont became more interfaith, which has been an amazing experience for all of our Christian students, as well as our faculty and our non-Christian students. So my recent work has been a similar process. I did a book on, it's called Rhythms of Religious Ritual. And it's the yearly cycles of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So we talk about the Christian year from Advent to Pentecost and ordinary time. And so I did that with some colleagues in Judaism and some Muslim colleagues to articulate the Muslim year and the Jewish year. Wow. And so now I've been putting this on the back burner for years because people keep asking me about it, but I haven't really wrapped my head around what I want to say about it yet, and that is interfaith worship. Mm. And again, there are issues of hospitality, it's issues of integrity, it's issues of spirituality, it's issues of healing across animosity and diversity, and yeah. So right now I'm working on an article on interfaith worship, and I'm approaching it from a Buddhist perspective because the previous book was on the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but Buddhism doesn't have a God. So there's no deity. And how do we do interfaith worship if we can't argue that we're all praying to the same God when prayer is defined differently? So that's my next avenue of research and writing. But without a doubt, I would not be who I am today without those other experiences in the world of persons with disabilities and certainly within the deaf community.
Wow, I am looking forward to your next book in Interfaith Worship. And I know that there's a lot of thought and research that has to go into that. I work with a local interfaith group. And even when we talk about making a social justice statement or a stance, it is a 2 to 3 week process to get everyone's response, their ideas on what they can say out of their faith and what would speak against what their faith is. And so I know that's going to be great. I can't wait to see that. Can't wait.
Well, and in this country, we still assume Christians are kind of the norm. So, and Protestant Christianity. So interfaith worship tends to be organized like a Protestant worship service. And we can't do anything without music, singing, and Muslims don't sing, right? So there's still power dynamics in this country around interfaith worship because we still assume that we're in power, Christians, that is, are in power, and we get to dictate or assume, not always dictate, but assume certain things, whether it's even just the structure or organization of what we're going to do together. So yeah, it's a complicated issue.
Yes. So here is a fun question. And of course, like all of the other questions, feel free to pass on it. But this was something that we had talked about early on, even when we began to have conversation about inviting you. And so what would it take for you to get back into the field of disability research, study, writing?
Well, since I just got my Medicare card, and am entering that fourth quarter of my life pretty soon. I think the diminishments that will accompany this last stage of my life may automatically dump me back in to this community conversation again. Yeah, so it's not that I haven't wanted to participate and keep up, but after ADA, the field blossomed. I know it doesn't seem like that, but just keeping up with the research and the books written in the fields of disability studies, when I was trying to keep up with liturgics and liturgy and homiletics, preaching, I just couldn't keep up with the material. I just couldn't keep up with the latest stuff that was happening. And so while I've done some, I really have not kept up with field. And so I don't feel like I'm an expert anymore in any way, shape, or form. So even if I were to get back into it, it would not be as an expert. It would be as a person who has a disability, who is interested in the topics that are going on, but I would not feel confident in any way to be a spokesperson for the community. And I didn't feel that way when I wrote a healing homiletic. That was also just a personal journey, but I sometimes wish I would have been able to keep up with that. And the other issue is, and this is a political issue and an identity issue, my spells of paralysis, I underwent some alternative medical treatments called Nan-Budrapad's allergy elimination technique. And I experienced relief from a lot of my spells. They were not as frequent, they were not as long. I functioned better. I didn't have to use my walker all the time. And when I showed up to a speaking engagement, a conference on ministry with persons with disabilities, and I didn't have my walker, I wasn't invited back anymore.
Oh my goodness.
So for me, I understood why I didn't look like a person with disabilities anymore. Now this was, and so I stopped getting speaking engagements in this area because I didn't portray myself in the same way that people expected when I arrived. And I get that. I was not upset about it. I get it. It's a identity, politics of identity is what we call it. I get that. And at the same time, it allowed me to put my energies and efforts in other areas.
Well, we're glad you did. But please hear that there are many of us that particularly, and I think I can speak for everyone in our group to say that that is not our feeling. That is not our stance. That's not our belief. We do recognize and understand that there are something called hidden disabilities.
Yep.
And so we don't want to discriminate against anyone. Which always amazes me is how we can get into that identity politics and discriminate against one another when we're all fighting for and working for the same goals prayerfully. We are. But hear this, that is not who we are. That's definitely not who we are. So, Jonathan, is there any questions from the
Yes, there are a couple questions that I'll go over quickly, but when I'm done, if you're okay, Dr. Black, we'd like to allow people that can't write into the chat to unmute themselves and to ask their question.
Sure.
So when I'm done, we're going to do that for a few minutes. If anyone can't write into the chat and would like to have that conversation. So first of all, a couple people have asked, have you thought about updating this version?
No,
Okay.
I haven't. I've never even thought about it, actually.
Okay.
I guess that's an odd thing to say, but I've never thought about it. I will
It's the
consider it.
25th anniversary.
It's so old. There's so much. It wouldn't be an update. It would have to be a total rewrite. It would have to be a total rewrite because there's so much has changed in 25 years in disability studies. Yeah, the whole medical model, cultural model, like there's just so much that has changed.
Yeah. Someone asked in the chat, do you have any suggestions for helping a congregation understand the unique needs of a pastor with a disability?
Oh, that is really, that's a really good question. In the United Methodist Church, it really is the job of the district superintendent to prepare and train a congregation. And we need to train the district superintendents. That needs to be part of when they become selected to be a district superintendent, they have district superintendent training, and that needs to be a part of it. In the same way that years ago, they had to be trained in, getting a congregation to accept a woman. So that needs to be part and parcel of the denomination's training for those. When you're in a call system denomination where the church interviews and the church hires a person with a disability, then you have different avenues by which to educate the congregation about what is needed. But they have specifically called you because they want you as a person with a disability to be their pastor. But in an appointment system, Episcopalian, United Methodist, where the bishop just says, here, congregation, you get this pastor now, then that needs to be the denomination's role to help with the training.
A few people have asked, what's the best way to reach you if they want to continue to have a conversation?
My email is kblack@CST for Claremont School of Theology .edu.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we're going to open it up to folks who weren't able to type into the chat their question. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, someone corrected me about the Episcopal Church. They have bishops, but they don't call in the same. They don't appoint in the same way.
Dr. Black, this is Reverend Justin Hancock. I'm a Methodist minister out of Dallas. And I'll admit to you, right now I have about 11 questions running through my brain. Because my wife is getting a PhD in disabled Christology. We run our own disability ministry, and so I'm going to try to ask just one question, but I'll definitely be emailing you with others. When I work with young people and people of all ages who are either in ministry in various denominations or who I am mentoring who are going into ministry, the struggle that we most often work through is boards and certifying agencies not really having a framework to onboard someone with a disability, which then translates into an economic question of being hired and being underemployed and overqualified for many of the jobs they can apply for. Knowing that, and you've touched on this throughout this talk, but knowing that if you had this to do over again, would you go back in and sort of turn up the volume on the economic side of or addressing the economic struggles of people with disabilities through the teachings of Jesus? Does that question make sense?
Yes, the question makes sense. And I think it's a great question and a topic that needs to be out there. It was not the focus of this book at all, because I was so geared on questions of medical care and
Sure.
healing versus cure and the preaching. So I was not doing general issues within the disability community, certainly for persons with disabilities and the economics. But I think you need to write it. I think you need to write about it.
That may be book number 2. So
Okay.
we're playing with that for a while, but thank you.
Anyone else that couldn't type into the chat that would like to share their questions?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Janine, and I have a question around any advice you would have around the whole ordination process, because it is filled with roadblocks and obstacles for people with disabilities. And it, I don't think it's gotten a lot better. And if it's dependent on DSs in the Methodist Church to understand, they don't.
Well, I'd be happy to address this question, but I just saw that Bishop Peggy Johnson is on this webinar. And so we have a bishop who might be able to answer this question. Are you there, Peggy?
I am, and it's not
Bishop,
good news.
Bishop, are you there?
I'm there, and I'm dying over this question because this is not good news, folks. I need you all to be just educating everybody all the way up the line, including bishops. And I have done my part. I've been fighting the good fight, but it is, I mean, I know things got better with ADA. You are totally right, Dr. Black. But somehow the church said, well, we're exempt. We don't have those.
That's exactly right.
We don't have those. The money, well, we can't afford the elevator. We can't afford interpreters. That's $50 an hour or whatever it is now. I mean, it's tough, but you know what? God makes a way out of no way. And you are addressing some of the most brilliant people in the denomination around this circle. I mean, I can't speak for the non-United Methodists here, but since COVID, this group has become superstars because they can connect now with Zoom and all the connectivities that this gift has brought us. I have seen such incredible growth in the last year and so. I'm thinking we're going to bust the lid off this thing. It's going to come from the grassroots up. Has nothing to do with the top down because they're so busy solving complaints and fixing the denomination and all the woes of, trying to right size and theologize and all the stuff we got going. That it's up to you, folks. Shine your lights. I'll be there on your balcony cheering you on.
Well, I just want you to know that you have an absolutely fabulous advocate in the Council of Bishops through Bishop Peggy Johnson. She comes from it in her heart, in her mind. She is deeply committed and has been fighting this fight for a very long time. And we are grateful for your work among us, especially at the higher echelons of our denomination.
It ain't good news, but I also want to give a shout out to retired Bishop Deb Kesey, who lives in Iowa. She also is a person with a disability who has been my partner in crime on the Council of Bishops. And together we're working on, and with the help of this a Ministers with Disabilities group, trying to get the Council of Bishops to issue a statement on behalf, a pastoral statement on behalf of people and clergy with disabilities.
And it's going slow, folks, but we're making some progress. So be praying for us. I've been working on this for like 13 years now, but I think it might happen. So let's pray for that, because if they really do issue a statement, they might have to keep their promises, is what they're saying. Is we believe in the body of Christ. We believe in the inclusivity. We believe in the giftedness of all people. And so just stay tuned. God might be doing something anyway.
Thank you for your work.
All good.
Anybody else that couldn't type in their question that would like to ask Dr. Black a question? Okay, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Russell.
So Bishop Johnson is our bishop, and that's what we can, no matter where we are around the country, in the disability community, she is what we call our bishop, and we are forever grateful for all the work in which she has done. And she is correct. It takes all of us, no matter where we are, to do this great work that God has called us to. Dr. Black, is there anything else that we may have missed that you would like to share that would add to this already rich conversation?
I think you all have asked me some great questions. I am thrilled to be a part of this. I am so deeply honored that you even remembered the book. It's so old, and yet wanted to celebrate it as well, and that it's still out there in existence. I am grateful for that, and for whatever God has done in people's lives through it. So in the end, we give thanks and glory to God for our work together as an interdependent community.
Amen. Well, Dr. Black, let me conclude my portion of this by saying that it has been an honor to have been with you on today. And I thank you for what has been a very, very, very delightful and informative and thought-provoking conversation. I do have to say again, I have not seen, whether you get the credit or not, I have not seen a training on the church and disabilities, on theology and disabilities, that did not quote you, because I know your quotes. And so I know when someone is quoting you, even if they don't give you the credit. And so your work continues to go just abroad. And I know within our denomination, the United Methodist Church, and other denominations, I know the UCC as well. I've seen your work quoted in their work as well. And so again, I just want to thank you for what you have done, for this groundbreaking work that you have done, and for the voice. And that's the thing for many of us, to have someone who is writing in these areas that's fully accepted, that is in academia, that expresses what we know intrinsically and from what we see, but to know that there are people who are writing in those areas, that means and has meant a lot to us. And so please hear me when I say, for this group, and I know that Hank and Jonathan can speak for themselves, and they probably will as we conclude, but I need to tell you how much your work has meant to the work that I continue to do to this day. And for that, I'm forever grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Russell.
Let me stop fanboying and allow me to turn this back over to Jonathan and to Hank.
Thank you, Russell. I want to thank MSFA. I want to thank you, of course, Reverend Yule, and I want to thank Dr. Black for being here. It's been a wonderful conversation. Before you run out the door, before you cut off your internet connection, we're going to ask you, please, I'm going to advocate, please join AMD. Especially if you're a person with a disability in ministry, You don't have to be a part of the Methodist Church. We are here to support and empower you. So please take the time, go to our website, become a member so you can be part of all of this great content that we're creating going forward. Including, I want to lift up our next time together, our next webinar. We're going to have speaking with us Dr. Michael D. Langford. He's a professor of theology at Seattle Pacific Seminary. He co-edited a book recently called Empowering Youth, and he's going to talk about his chapter about the intersectionality between what folks with disabilities deal with in terms of being ignored at the church level, as well as what folks who are young deal with about unfortunately being ignored and unheard at the church level. So we hope you'll join us for that conversation. It's going to be July 10th, 12 p.m. Eastern and 9 a.m. Pacific. So we hope you'll join us there. And blessings to everyone. Thank you for joining us, and blessings on your ministry and your work going forward. God goes with you, and so do we. Amen.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Black. Wonderful discussion.
Thank you, interpreters.
Yes.